What a treat it is to be here together as we celebrate the birth of Christ. I do wish you a great celebration, however that is happening for you over the next couple of days. The joyful announcement of the angel to the shepherds, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior who is Christ the Lord," resonates, doesn't it? Fear not. The language of the angel goes something like, stop being afraid. Stop being afraid. And in the year that we've had and continue to have, that is a good word for us, that Jesus' people are good news people in a bad news world. And tonight is a great night to remember that. My prayer for the past 10 days or so has been that for all that feels different about Christmas this year, the disruption to our usual traditions might cause us to see in fresh ways the good news of Christ's birth. So tonight, and briefly, I'd like to reflect on the visit of the Magi to Bethlehem, which reminds us that the arrival of the King really is good news for all people and for the people that we've just sung and contemplated about, and for the ways that we see ourselves in the song that Lisa just sang for us. People who are outsiders, people whose story doesn't seem to fit, people going through challenging times, people who perhaps have begun a spiritual journey very, very far away from God indeed. And perhaps we all feel a bit that way this Christmas time. So let me read the story, and I'll ask us all a question just to set the stage. From Matthew's Gospel in chapter 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. My question for us to consider, it's an easy one, but do you have in your memory, do you have an aroma that you especially associate with Christmas time? Is there something that you especially remember, maybe from childhood or maybe recently, that you associate with the season? I think for me, it's definitely ham baking in the oven. And I'll tell you the story why. I only knew one set of grandparents, really. My dad's dad died when my dad was young, and so I knew my mom's parents and actually lived with them for a year when I was young. And my grandfather was definitely Team Ham. He was Team Ham all the way. Christmas ham was so important to him that we began talking about the Christmas ham just after dessert on Thanksgiving. And he would always ask a question, and for a while I thought it was a sincere question. He'd say, "Do you think we should have ham this year for Christmas?" And then I realized this is a hypothetical question. It's really just a tease. Of course we're having ham for Christmas. And it was great. We always did. And they'd make cherry sauce and we'd put it on the ham. And whenever I have warm ham, it reminds me of Christmas. And those are good memories. And I hope that you have a good memory like that too. Maybe a fresh cut pine tree or cookies baking or something like that. I wonder, and I've wondered as I've thought about the Magi and the gifts that they bring to young Jesus that we read about in the story, I wonder if myrrh became an aroma that Jesus associated with his birthday. It's interesting in the story of Jesus at different places where this aromatic gift shows up in different places along the way. And let's think about that just for a little bit, because really it becomes, as the story of the gospel unfolds, the aroma of good news. And that's what we need to hear about tonight. In the story of the Magi, it's the aroma of recognition. Gift giving, right? Do you like to give gifts? Do you like to give the perfect gift? Do you like to be the person who gives the gift that shows that you know the recipient so well that you have locked in on exactly what they want? If that question makes you nervous, there still is one more shopping day until Christmas. You've picked the right service to come to this year. But the Magi choose perfect gifts for Jesus. It's not that they set out to go on their journey from the east to Bethlehem to where Jesus is and rummage through the drawers and try to re-gift a couple of things just in case they meet the king along the way. But they choose perfect gifts for who they expect to meet. And they do expect to meet the king. It's interesting. Magi are religious leaders themselves. They are men who use astronomy or astrology or dream interpretation to try to understand spiritual realities in the world. And in the Bible, they have a long history. If you go back to the story of Daniel, of the lion's den, then you remember that Magi appear in chapter 2, that King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon has a dream he wants interpreted. He summons to himself dream interpreters. Those are Magi. And they are not able to interpret the dream. Daniel, this young Jewish captive, he's not in Babylon by choice. He's been taken to Babylon in captivity, is with God's help able to interpret the dream, and the story unfolds from there. But one of the things that's interesting about that story is it means that the Magi grew up alongside of Jewish people for at least 600 years. For at least 600 years, the Magi, who were interested in spiritual things, would have been learning about the hopes and dreams of the Jewish people. They would have been learning about the story of the Jewish faith. They would have been learning from the prophets even as they continued to work. And then in the 600 years, between Daniel and the birth of Jesus, they would have been acquiring more information. They would have learned about God's ancient promise to King David, that King David would have a descendant who would rule forever. Over time, Magi would have learned about the Jewish hope that this promised king would come and be born. And it's not for sure that these Magi who show up in Bethlehem are from Babylon or from Saudi Arabia or from some other part of the East, but surely they are informed by rubbing shoulders with, living with, learning about God's people who are waiting for the king to come. And Matthew shows up when they arrive from the east. They arrive with gifts fit for royalty, gifts which are perfectly informed by the worship and the hope of God's people. Now, gold it's always a good gift. I mean, again, if you're struggling tonight and wondering what to do, gold's always a good gift. It's a gift, sorry, Kim. It's a gift fit for a king. But more perfectly, God said in the prophecy of Isaiah that when his glory returned to Israel, at some point in the future, that caravans of nations, of non-Jewish people, would bring gold to worship this event. He talks about this in chapter 60 and in verse 6. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. These are modern day eastern places. Sheba and Kedar are in modern day Saudi Arabia. Nebaioth is in modern-day Jordan. The prophecy is such that when God's glory returns to Israel, people from Saudi Arabia, people from Jordan, non-Jewish people, will be streaming to worship the arrival of God's glory, that they'll bring gold, they'll bring frankincense, they'll bring these expensive gifts to celebrate the return of glory to Israel. And this in and of itself is a powerful application for us when we feel like outsiders to what God might be doing in the world. You know, as we go on in time and as more and more of our neighbors grow up outside of the church and unfamiliar with the basic Christian message, and even the announcement of Christmas can sound strange, it is good to remember that as Matthew tells the story of Christmas, it starts with outsiders coming to worship the King. God's King is born for faraway people. And this makes frankincense a perfect gift too. So frankincense or incense was used in Old Testament worship. The association of incense with worship created an association between the aroma of the incense and the majesty of God's name. So that through the final prophet in the Old Testament, Malachi, we read, "From the rising of the sun to its setting, my name will be great among the nations, and every place incense will be offered to my name, and a pure offering, for my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord of hosts." And so now the Magi come from the nations, and they bring with them incense to tell of the greatness of the name of the Lord from all over the world, so to speak. They are a microcosmic representation of Malachi 1. The nations proclaiming the great name of the Lord. And in Psalm 45, the aroma of myrrh is associated with God's victorious royal Davidic king, a king descended from the line of David. This is what Psalm 45 says. The entire psalm is apt for Christmas Eve, but verses 7 and 8 help us. "You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you the king with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Your robes are fragrant with myrrh." And the psalm goes on from there. It speaks of this great, perfect king who would come, empowered and enabled by the Lord, recognized as wonderful, a king from God's people for the whole world, worthy of the worship of the nations. The Magi bring the perfect gifts. Parents love to tell children stories about their children's birth, especially on a couple of different occasions, around the child's birthday and whenever the child brings a boyfriend or girlfriend home. This is the season of life that we're in, so we get to tell birth stories a lot. Could Joseph and Mary have been much different? They had birth stories to tell. As they told and as they retold Jesus the story of his birth and the visit of the Magi and the gifts of the Magi, I wonder if the aroma of myrrh would have reinforced their recognition of who this boy was. I wonder if the aroma of myrrh would have spoken to Jesus' imagination about who he is and what lays before him in his identity as the Messiah, as God's King. The aroma of myrrh is the aroma of recognition. The recognition that this child in Bethlehem is God's King, the true descendant of David, the one anointed, as we read in Psalm 45, with the oil of gladness beyond his companions. The aroma of recognition. But the aroma of recognition in the life of Jesus becomes, secondly, the aroma of rejection. Recognition and rejection are the tension points in the story of the Magi's visit to Bethlehem. We feel it when we read the story. The gifts underscore the Magi's recognition of Jesus' identity. Matthew, the gospel writer, wants us to see this. Matthew, the gospel writer, wants us to see this because of how he starts the story of Jesus in chapter 1 when he introduces who Jesus is by telling us about Jesus' genealogy. He says the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So he says, I'm going to tell you the story of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And the son of David part we've already landed on. We understand David is the king that God promised descendant would always sit on Israel's throne. But that's the tension point. Because as Jesus arrives, the current king of the day, Herod, is a puppet king installed by the Roman emperor who's not a descendant of David. And Herod is troubled, to say the least, when Magi show up and say, "Where is he who's been born king of the Jews?" This is a problematic statement if you style yourself the king of the Jews. Rival kings aren't good for business. So Herod's investigation of Jesus is an investigation unto rejection. And it's interesting. He calls together a meeting of the experts, and he says, I've gotten some inquiries about the king of the Jews being born, and it seems to not have happened in my palace. So where could this have happened? And they tell him, the theologians of the day, in Bethlehem of Judea. And they quote the prophecy that identifies Bethlehem as the place from which the shepherd of Israel will emerge. And what's interesting in the account is what is not written. Who doesn't go to Bethlehem? The theologians don't go to Bethlehem. The Old Testament scholars don't go to Bethlehem. Herod doesn't go to Bethlehem. It's interesting, and again, one of the things that I learned on our trip to Israel a couple of years ago, at least from where we stayed in Jerusalem, is you could actually see Bethlehem from Jerusalem. It's not like it was hours away by plane. I just don't have time. I can't get the trip to Bethlehem into my schedule. They could see it. And they didn't go. They had years where they could have gone to see what was happening in Bethlehem, and they didn't show up. There's a lesson in that. It's rejection by omission, so to speak. Herod wants to get rid of a rival. The theologians don't take the time to find him, but the Magi go. And that's what Matthew wants us to see. Because Jesus being born is not just the son of David, he's also the son of Abraham. Abraham, earlier in the story of the Bible than David, Abraham, to one God made a promise that through Abraham, all of the nations of the world would be blessed. One would come who would be a blessing for Gentiles, for faraway people. And here the Gentiles, the faraway people, go and they look for Jesus. This is what Matthew wants us to see. It's no mistake in Matthew's gospel that the first exuberant worshipers of the King of the Jews are non-Jews. It's invitational to everyone. And the Magi are not just a little happy. In verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced a tiny bit. It says they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. It's like the writer, Matthew, runs out of vocabulary to describe how amazed the Magi are that they meet Jesus. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down, they worshiped him. They gave him the best gifts that they could give, the perfect gifts. Herod recognizes the threat. He recognizes the arrival of God's king as threatening. And the story of Jesus' rejection as king by many of the powerful of this day culminates in the cross. Of course, we flash forward in the story, and we'll take it from Mark's gospel in chapter 15, where Pilate says to the people who've brought Jesus to him, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cry out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to him, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." And as Mark tells the story, myrrh becomes the aroma not of recognition but of rejection. Here's how. Mark 15 and 21, they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry Jesus' cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Wine and myrrh mixed together were a basic anesthesia. And they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." Now, I can't say whether the aroma of the myrrh mixed with wine in that moment reminded Jesus of his birthday gifts from the Magi. That would be too much to say. But we do know that the aroma of the myrrh in that moment was the aroma of rejection. It was the aroma of people who had met the king and who had said, "No, thank you." 3 times in Mark's gospel, Jesus tells us to fully anticipate this moment. He says, for example, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." Jesus knows that this is before him, and he also knows why. He tells us in verse 45 of the same chapter, "Even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." A ransom, of course, is a payment paid by one person for the freedom of another person. And Jesus shorthands his mission this way. He's come to be the payment that frees many. And that's why he says no to the anesthesia. Because he's there to endure undulled the consequence for our sin and for our rebellion, for all of the ways that we fail to love God, for the ways that we fail to love our neighbors. He's there to endure the sin of the Magi's career spent serving idols before they came and worshiped the King. To be the ransom for our moments when unbelief seems to overpower faith, when faith grows dull, where we doubt. And amazingly, the aroma of rejection is one which the king is willing to breathe until he breathes no more in order to exhaust God's punishment on sin. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us. And we wonder, can it be true? Can it be true? Well, the aroma of rejection becomes the aroma of victory in John's gospel. John tells us this. Nicodemus, who, if you were here this past Sunday, we met in this sermon. Nicodemus, the theologian who came by night, who had questions and doubts about Jesus, who did not at that point in John's gospel in chapter 3 follow after Jesus, does now in chapter 19 follow after Jesus. And John tells us this. Nicodemus, who earlier when he'd come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and olive, about 75 pounds in weight. That is a lot of spice. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. They lay him dead in the tomb, bound with 75 pounds worth of myrrh. And you know how the story continues. In John 20, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. She saw the stone had been taken away. She ran. She reports this to Peter. Peter and John run to the tomb, and they discover it empty because Jesus is alive. He's resurrected. And as we often remember, Jesus' resurrection is resurrection to new physical life after real physical death. It is not a kind of a reanimation in a ghost-like existence, but it is a resurrection with kind of the same and more physical properties, physical senses that we have. And so I just ponder this. 75 pounds of myrrh makes quite an aroma. And I wonder what it is like when you wake up from death and you take that first breath. What the first thing you smell might be. How could it have not been that? Myrrh enclosed in the tomb with the stone. 75 pounds is intended to do a job of covering and masking what happens in a burial. And Jesus wakes and he takes his first breath and he smells myrrh, the aroma of recognition, which had become the aroma of rejection, which is now the aroma of victory. And I just wonder if he breathes in his first breath in his new physical life, and he says, I was born, and now I'm reborn for this. The king is here. I was born for this. I was born to welcome outsiders and those far away. I was born to die for the sins of my people. I was born to die for those who rejected me in my lifetime. I was born to die and to rise for those who will come after. I was born to rise again. I was born to be alive forever and to not reign as a far-off, aloof king who was unfamiliar with pain and unfamiliar with suffering, but to reign as a battle-scarred king who knows the fullest extent of suffering unto death, and who knows more than we know what it is like to be alive again. It's the aroma of victory. It's how much he loves us. We remember it on Christmas Eve, and we embrace it. Not, as was just sung in the song, because we're strong, but because we're weak and he's strong. He was recognized as king. He was rejected as king. He was vindicated as king. And he is today alive as king. So as we conclude this service, as we hear Kelsey sing of the King of Kings, as we sing Silent Night, as we sing Joy to the World, we're not just singing songs about a traditional event. We're singing songs to a king who is alive today. Let's sing them with glad hearts, because the king has come, and he has won, and he is returning.